Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Miller, and I'm editor of American Vegetable Grower magazine. We're going to be talking with Lisa K. Johnson, who is a senior research scholar with North Carolina State University. And she wrote our cover story for the August issue of American Vegetable Grower. Lisa and her colleague, Rebecca Dunning, have done a study to find out what is left in the field after the final harvest. There is a industry idea that only a small percentage of the crop is left in the field, and it's something not to worry about, that we calculate it pretty well. But what their study has learned when they go in is that there's a lot of crop left in the field, a lot more than we thought. They look at the crop, they assess how much of it's marketable, how much of it is edible. In other words, how much you can sell and make a profit, and how to calculate if it's worth going back in one more time and make a profit. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
All right, first of all, I'm curious, what gave you the idea to do this study in the first place?
Well, I started getting interested in the issue of wasted food, which has hit the media really hard. And being a lifelong horticulturist, I thought, where is the information on specialty crops? I dug into it for a couple of years, really, finding that I couldn't find the data that I was interested in, which was how much per acre by crop are we leaving in the field. And I looked several places for this, ended up calling universities, our government, nonprofits to try and determine who was working on this issue, and found out that nobody was. So I said, well, I've got to get to the bottom of this myself, and designed a research program around that question.
So describe what you're doing whenever you go into the field. How do you find that number to measure? How do you figure out what you're going to, how much is left in there? What method did you use?
Well, it's a challenging question. The first thing you have to understand is kind of the interval the grower is using to harvest the crop. If it's something like summer squash, they might be harvesting every day or every other day, depending on the weather. And so if you get a notice from a grower that they have stopped harvesting the crop, it's been my intent to go in and take a measurement at that harvest interval, whether it's 1 day or 2 days after after the last harvest, to get an accurate picture of what would be maturing at that time. It's very straightforward to take a sample and then scale up measurement in the field. It's very similar to measuring harvest potential at the beginning of the season. But what I do is mark a few rows at random in the field. I like to try and hit 0.1% of the field area to be totally accurate. But if you're a grower, you don't need to do that. You might want to take efficiency of sampling into consideration rather than accuracy. And so then I mark those areas off in the field, harvest everything that's left on the plant, and then sort it into categories of marketable according to that grower's specifications, edible in that it's fresh, healthy, you could eat it, it's not damaged, but just doesn't meet those buyer specifications, or inedible in that it's damaged, diseased, overmature, and really wouldn't be good for human consumption according to our American cultural standards, right? And so then when you sort that out, you sort out your sample, weigh those samples out, then you can just extrapolate from there how much is in 1 acre. If you've got, 30 acres of a certain crop or 100 acres, you can then tell from there how much is left in the field. It was my intent to then show growers with that information, you could then pick up the phone to a buyer and suggest, hey, I've got X amount in the field. Are you interested in it, before that grower even harvests it?
Okay, great. By the way, the article went online today, and so we do have those formulas that you used in order to figure out how much crop you have and how to extrapolate it to an acre, and then, of course, to how large the field is
very
overall.
Exciting.
Yeah. Good. All right. How long does it take to do all that?
Yeah, that's it.
And I'm talking about the harvesting
Yeah,
part.
that's a great question. People are always interested in how long it takes. As with any question in farming, it really depends. It depends on how much is left out there. And it depends how many people you have, that kind of thing. It depends on how big your sample areas are that you've decided you need to take. So, for example, I measured some cabbage in the field last month in 30 minutes. But it might, if you have something like, say, green beans or kale that you have to look at each and every piece, it might take a couple of hours to determine what is marketable and edible in that case. But if it's something that, you're looking at each unit and the unit is kind of a decent size, like a cucumber, a pepper, a sweet potato, something like that, you can determine pretty quickly which category it's going to fall into. And harvesting itself is pretty speedy, so it
Okay.
doesn't take that long. But that is an important question that growers
Okay.
always want to know.
So I can tell each crop has its own quirks, and each crop's results. I know from the article that you had different results on what was marketable and edible, depending on the crop as well. So there's a lot of variables there, and I could see that being kind of difficult to figure out what to do with that. So, are you anticipating there to be like a more predictable, enough, if this study is done often enough, you're going to be able to predict watermelon is always going to have something in the field that's worth another crop, whereas maybe beans won't. I'm using those completely ignorantly. I don't know if those are the crops that even uses those examples. But are you anticipating something like that?
Well, I would love to anticipate something like that. The thing with field sampling is it does take a little bit of money. It takes a little bit of time to do. And so there aren't many studies like this one. Now, if you were a grower and wanted to gain more knowledge about your crop and make better decisions about your crop for your organization, it doesn't take too much for you to put a scout in the field to do some sampling and then bring you that data back so that you can calculate and figure out what the right decision is for that crop. But undertaking larger studies like this, I don't see happening too much in the future. If it did happen, of course, we'd have a lot better predictive ways to figure out what crops are worth going after and what crops aren't. From the data that we do have and the very basic economic analysis that we did, we could see it was much more, there was much more potential profitability in some crops than in others. I can attribute that pretty easily to how much of the crop was left in the field that was marketable and edible, how much of the crop that was left in the field that was inedible, in other words, that was getting in your way of getting to those other marketable and edible crops, and how valuable that crop is in and of itself. So for example, in our study, we saw that summer squash and cabbage were really never worth going after again, based on how much was left in the field and how much was left that you were having to go through in order to get to that marketable and edible portion. And also they at the time didn't have super high prices. So something that was more valuable with a lot left in the field, like green pepper and sweet potato, for example, in North Carolina, did seem to be worth going back in the field for. But I suspect what has happened over time is growers have run into those crops that weren't worth going after once or twice, like the cabbage, like the summer squash, and have lost money going back in the field. And so then take that approach on all of their crops, or on, at least a wider variety of crops. And my suggestion would be to do some measurement on your own farm, maybe get a baseline measurement, see what you're leaving in the field routinely, and then you can start routinely making different decisions if you see a way forward on that.
Now, you worked with Rebecca Dunning on this study, correct? And was her part more
Yeah.
looking at the aftermarket, looking at who you could be selling this to? Because I imagine there's going to be if you're trying to sell the edible crop or the ugly food, as it's called, there's a lot of growers who don't have a list of suppliers that they would sell to. They don't have a market out there that they are aware of. How do they go about finding the right groups to sell to? How do they figure out the market for that?
Well, that's a great question. Here in North Carolina, what we have done is provide that information to growers on what options are there for an alternative market. So we gave growers a list of contact information for a variety of companies that are interested in surplus, that are interested in misshapen and maybe blemished produce. So for example, these would be processors, the emerging ugly produce market, or potentially food banks that are able to pay for produce. So all of those options exist for our growers here in North Carolina, really depending on the crop. And so I have been able to provide that information to those growers right away.
Okay.
Obviously, it would be different regionally.
Right. Well, that makes me wonder, are you aware of any other studies like this happening now that you've kind of shown what can be done and what can be measured? Do you expect it to be studied elsewhere?
I would love for it to be studied elsewhere. Quite frankly, we need more information. In North Carolina, I've just scratched the surface. It would have been infinitely better to do a multi-year study with a lot more farms, but ultimately it's a sensitive topic. Growers aren't that interested in something that's not currently making them money, rightly so. And so they struggle to understand why it might be important to look at what we're not currently using. But as you know, that's how you improve and become more efficient and potentially more profitable, is when you look at what you're not utilizing. There are a few studies that have occurred in different places. The kind of trend to understand this started in Europe, moved to Canada, and then the west coast of the United States, and is kind of creeping across the country. But there have been a few studies in recent years that are similar to mine. Most studies undertake more of a survey and interview approach rather than a field measurement approach. And there are benefits to both. I feel like during surveys and interviews, growers may underestimate what is in the field. I've done interviews with growers myself, and many of them don't know what's in the field to begin with. And so measurement is a great way to really get a handle on it. The only studies that I know of that have done direct measurement in the field, one is from Santa Clara University in California. And there have been a couple of reports by the World Wildlife Fund where they have sponsored data collection around the country on different crops. So on potato, tomato, peaches, and lettuce. So they have put out a study as well. But there are other studies that you could read about that are based on survey and interview data. There's one from Vermont, one from Minnesota, one from UC Davis in California. And I feel like work is starting in Colorado based on some contacts that I have there. And I wouldn't be surprised if some more charitable organizations that do gleaning would start collecting data on this.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, Lisa.
Of course. Thank you.